So, July 1st, 2026, Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, the two most senior envoys of the Trump administration, just landed in Doha, Qatar. They flew all the way out there to meet with mediators. They're trying to salvage an MOU that is starting to crack apart at the seams, and Iran refused to show up. Not because they didn't send anyone. Iran's technical delegation was in Doha, but they flat out refused to sit in the same room as Witkoff or Kushner. Every single conversation had to go through Qatar intermediaries. And right on cue, right on schedule, every major news channel in the Western world drew the same conclusion. Iran is weakening. Iran is being cornered. Iran is buying time because they're losing leverage at the negotiating table. Okay? I want to argue the exact opposite. Because here's what's actually happening. While everyone is watching the theater in Doha, three things just occurred at the exact same time that almost nobody, and I mean almost nobody, is connecting together. One, Ghalibaf, Iran's chief negotiator, who also happens to be the Speaker of Parliament, just announced that Iran has exported more than 40 million barrels of oil in less than 2 weeks. Less than 2 weeks, guys. Since the US lifted its naval blockade. Two, Iran is pushing hard, not suggesting, not requesting, pushing for mandatory fees on every single ship that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. And I want to be very precise about this word, okay? Mandatory, not voluntary, not a service contribution, mandatory. Three, Hezbollah just declared the US brokered trilateral framework agreement between America, Israel, and Lebanon to be an act of treason. And they said they will hold their weapons tighter than ever before. Now, the media is treating these as three separate stories happening in three different locations on the map. They are not three separate stories. They are one strategy. One single coherent strategy designed to do exactly one thing, force the United States to choose between its public position and its actual leverage. And in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to walk you through exactly what is happening beneath the surface. We're not going to talk about missile counts or troop numbers. We're going to talk about the structural logic, the invisible architecture that is driving everything you see in the news right now. And when we're done, I think you'll understand why the question the media keeps asking, will Iran sign a final deal, is actually the wrong question. The right question is this. On day 61, when the 60-day window closes, which side is going to be in more pain? Okay? Let's get into it. Let me start with a number that I guarantee you have not seen, given its full context in any mainstream outlet. 40 million barrels of oil in less than 2 weeks. Ghalibaf announced this publicly like it was a military victory. And in a certain sense, guys, it is. Now think about what that means. Iran just went through a direct war with the United States and Israel. Their nuclear facilities were destroyed in Operation Midnight Hammer. Khamenei died in an airstrike. Inflation is running at 88.6%. I'm not pretending these are small things. These are real, serious, undeniable losses. But here's what's also true. Iran is selling oil massively. 40 million barrels in under 2 weeks. And independent maritime tracking sources are actually putting the number higher, closer to 50 million barrels. Now, with oil prices elevated precisely because of this war that everyone said was going to break Iran, you can do the math yourself on what that revenue looks like. It's not a small number. And here's what Ghalibaf actually said. And I want you to really listen to this, okay? He called the Strait of Hormuz, and these are his words, not mine, a divine gift that God granted Iran during this war. And he called it their greatest instrument of power, okay? Stop right there. The head of Iran's negotiating team, the man who is sitting in Doha at this very moment, called a strategic waterway a weapon, not an international shipping lane, not a maritime right under international law. A weapon, his weapon. This is not a slip of the tongue. This is a strategic declaration. Now, let me explain why that statement matters more than anything else happening in the news cycle today. Look at the geography. The Strait of Hormuz is about 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. You could almost swim across it on a good day. And yet, through that tiny bottleneck, 20% of the world's entire oil supply passes every single day. Japan gets 75% of its imported energy through that strait. China gets 40%. India gets 60%. The Japanese Prime Minister literally said on the record that if Hormuz closes, Japan's economy collapses within 8 to 9 months. Not years, months. Iran knows this. Obviously, they know this. They've known this for decades, and right now they are using it. Iran is pushing for mandatory fees on all shipping through Hormuz. Oman proposed a voluntary framework like a service charge for maritime maintenance. Iran said no, has to be mandatory. And you might think, okay, Professor, what's the practical difference between voluntary and mandatory? Both involve Iran getting paid, right? The difference is sovereignty. That's the entire difference. Voluntary means you're charging a service fee, you're a toll operator. Mandatory means you are asserting that this is your sovereign territory and everyone who enters must submit to your authority. Iran doesn't want to be a toll collector. Iran wants the world to formally acknowledge that one of the most strategically critical waterways on earth is under Iranian jurisdiction. Secretary Rubio drew a red line. He said mandatory fees on an international waterway violate international law. And technically, he's correct. But I want to ask a question, a very simple, very practical question. Who enforces that? What is the actual enforcement mechanism here? Because if the answer is the US Navy, the same Navy just lifted a naval blockade because the military and political cost of sustaining it became too high, then that's a very interesting enforcement mechanism, isn't it? Okay? Let me give you a framework to understand what Iran is actually doing right now. I call it the economic blood transfusion strategy. The concept is simple. A country that suffers serious damage in a war can recover dramatically faster than anyone predicts if it controls a resource that the global economy literally cannot function without. Iran doesn't need to rebuild every destroyed facility immediately. They don't need to fix every piece of damaged infrastructure right now. They just need to open the oil valve and maintain operational control over the strait. The money flows in and handles the rest. This is why Ghalibaf was smiling when he talked about those export numbers. Not because Iran is winning on the battlefield, but because Iran is winning financially. And in geopolitics over the long term, the financial game almost always outlasts the military game. History shows us this over and over. And this changes the entire context of the Doha talks because Iran is not sitting down to negotiate as a desperate country gasping for oxygen. They are negotiating as a country with growing oil revenue, a functioning energy weapon, and a structural advantage in a waterway that Europe, China, Japan, and India cannot afford to lose access to. That is a very different negotiating position than the one the media keeps describing. All right? Now let me talk about what I genuinely believe is the biggest strategic mistake the United States is making in this entire conflict. And to understand it properly, we need to go back to 1978. On June 26, 2026, the US arranged a deal called the Trilateral Framework Agreement between America, Israel, and Lebanon. 14 points, signed in Washington. And the real goal, even though no official will say this plainly, is to pull Lebanon and Hezbollah out of Iran's axis of resistance. This strategy has a name in international relations scholarship. It's called a wedge strategy. And the United States used this exact strategy with spectacular historic success exactly one time before. In Egypt, in 1978, here's what happened. America pulled Egypt out of the Arab coalition and out of the Soviet sphere of influence with one deal. Washington pressured Israel to return the entire Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, not part of it, all of it, plus billions of dollars in annual aid. President Sadat agreed. Egypt signed a peace deal with Israel. The Arab United Front collapsed from within, and the Soviet Union lost its most important Arab client state overnight. This is considered one of the greatest geopolitical achievements of the entire Cold War era for the United States. And it was. It genuinely was. Brilliant strategy. And now, in 2026, the United States is trying to do the exact same thing with Lebanon. And the formula looks almost identical on the surface. $100 million in humanitarian assistance, $30 million reimbursed directly to the Lebanese armed forces. America leading an international reconstruction coalition. Israel withdrawing from southern Lebanon in phases. In exchange, Lebanon disarms Hezbollah and declares that no external force can use violence on Lebanon's behalf without explicit government authorization, which is a very elegant way of saying, Iran, get your hands off Lebanon. On paper, this looks like a perfect copy of Camp David 1978. In reality, I think it's a disaster in slow motion. And I want to name this problem, I call it the reverse Camp David trap. And here's the core of it. In 1978, the United States was separating one nation state from an external superpower. Sadat had absolute command authority over the Egyptian military. When he decided to expel the Soviet advisors and sign peace with Israel, he could do that with one executive order. The Egyptian military followed orders. The state held together. The Soviets had no choice but to pack their bags and leave. In 2026, the United States is trying to separate Lebanon from a force that is not external to Lebanon at all. Hezbollah is not a foreign power operating on Lebanese soil. They are deeply structurally embedded in Lebanon's political system, its social welfare networks, its economic infrastructure. They have sitting members of parliament. They run hospitals. They operate schools. They have weapons caches, command structures, and decades of community relationships built in the fabric of the country. And more than any of that, more than the weapons, more than the political representation, Hezbollah has a veto. A political veto inside Lebanon, right now, within minutes of the framework agreement being signed in Washington. Hezbollah MP Hassan Fadlallah announced publicly that they will hold their weapons tighter than ever before. Lebanese Parliament Speaker Nabi Berri, Hezbollah's most important political ally, warned that Lebanon is standing at the edge of a new civil war. Okay? Does that make sense to you? Do you see what that means structurally? Iran doesn't need to fire a single missile. Hezbollah doesn't need to attack anyone. They just need to say no. One word. No. And the entire framework collapses from the inside because there is no mechanism, zero, through which anyone can enforce the disarmament clause against Hezbollah's active refusal. Because the Lebanese armed forces, the LAF, do not have the military capacity or the political capital to forcibly disarm Hezbollah. They are not strong enough. And if they tried, if the LAF actually moved against Hezbollah with serious force, there is a real documented historical risk that the Lebanese army splinters along sectarian lines and Lebanon slides into civil war. Again, this is the reverse Camp David trap. America is applying a 20th century playbook to a 21st century structural problem. In 1978, the obstacle was getting one leader to make one decision. In 2026, the obstacle is getting a non-state actor with deep domestic roots to disarm against their will, using a national army that is too fragile to attempt it. These are completely different problems, and treating them as the same problem is a serious analytical error. Now, let me connect this back to Doha, because this is where the pieces fit together. Why won't Iran sit across the table from Witkoff and Kushner directly? Vance called it a Persian negotiating tactic, and I find that framing genuinely interesting. But I think there's a cleaner explanation. Iran knows that Doha is not the arena where this gets won or lost. The real battle is being fought in two places simultaneously. First, in Beirut, where the trilateral framework agreement will either survive or collapse. And Iran already knows that Hezbollah's veto makes it collapse. They built a system. They understand it better than Washington does. Iran doesn't need to be in Doha to win in Beirut. They just need to be patient. Second, at Hormuz, where Iran is setting facts on the ground every single day that shape what any future agreement can realistically contain. Every barrel of oil exported, every tanker that passes without interference, every negotiation about mandatory versus voluntary fees. Iran is building structural leverage that doesn't disappear when the 60-day clock runs out. By refusing direct meetings, Iran is sending one message. We don't need to sit across from you to accumulate advantage. Our advantage is being built somewhere you aren't watching closely enough. And I have to say, that is a sophisticated position for a country that supposedly just got crushed in a war. Now, I want to do something I think is essential at this point in the analysis. I want to present the strongest possible case for the other side, because I never want you to just accept what I'm telling you. That would defeat the entire purpose of this. So, let me stillman the American position. Let me give you the best version of why Vance might be right. Vance said that America is in a win-win situation. Whether negotiations succeed or fail, Washington comes out ahead. And here is the serious version of that argument. The United States destroyed Iran's nuclear facilities. The supreme leader is dead. Iran's missile program took significant damage. Inflation is at 88% and climbing. The Iranian economy is under crushing pressure. From this vantage point, America is negotiating from genuine strength. Iran needs this deal to survive economically. So no matter what Iran demands at the table, no matter how much theater they put on in Doha, eventually the economic pressure will force real concessions. And this argument has strong historical precedent. This is exactly how the US managed Iraq after 1991. Sustained pressure, military superiority, economic strangulation through sanctions. It worked, at least until the next round of complications. I want to acknowledge something uncomfortable. This argument is not irrational. There are genuine, substantive reasons to believe that sustained, coordinated American pressure could eventually push Iran toward meaningful compromise. I'm not dismissing that. The military achievements were real. The damage to Iran is real. But here is precisely what the Steelman argument cannot explain, and this is the part that matters. It cannot explain why, after literally decades of sanctions, Iran still had an active nuclear program when this war began. It cannot explain how, even under a naval blockade, Iran managed to export 40 to 50 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks, the moment that blockade lifted. These are not the behaviors of a country that has exhausted its options. But the biggest thing the win-win argument cannot explain is the variable that didn't exist in 1991. China and Russia. In 1991, the United States had something I call monopoly on reward power. Washington was the only actor on earth capable of giving Iran everything it needed to genuinely recover: access to capital markets, technology, export infrastructure, integration into the global trading system. There was no alternative. The Soviet Union had collapsed. China was still a developing country. The US held all the cards. In 2026, China is purchasing Iranian oil through shipping documentation that records zero country of origin. Russia is supplying military technology and is blocking serious pressure at the UN Security Council, not because they love Iran. Let's be honest. Nobody in geopolitics operates on love, but because if Iran collapses under American pressure, it sends a message to every country in the Russia-China orbit: don't defy the United States, because there is no safety net. And that is a message Beijing and Moscow cannot afford to let go out. When you have both Beijing and Moscow providing economic and diplomatic insurance for Tehran, the American pressure campaign cannot reach the critical mass it needs to force genuine capitulation. The leverage is real. It's just not sufficient in a multipolar world the way it was in a unipolar one. That's the structural gap in the Vance argument. And it's not a small gap, okay? Now let me add one more layer. And this is the layer I think is most important for understanding where this goes over the next 6 to 18 months. Many analysts, serious analysts, people I respect, are concluding that Iran's axis of resistance has been severely degraded by this war. The axis being Hezbollah, the Houthis, the armed groups in Iraq. And the argument goes Iran's forward defense doctrine has been exposed as weaker than advertised. The proxies show their limits. The whole network is diminished. In terms of raw numbers, that assessment is defensible. But weakened and finished are two completely different things. And I think conflating them is a very serious analytical error. Let me give you a framework. I call it the octopus strategy. Here's what you need to understand about an octopus. You can cut off one of its tentacles. The octopus survives. Some species can actually regenerate the tentacle. And during the regeneration period, the remaining tentacles don't become passive. They become more independent, more adaptive, harder to target precisely because they're no longer operating as a single coordinated unit. This is exactly what is happening with the axis of resistance right now. Look at what actually happened during the war. When Iran itself was under direct attack, its proxy forces acted with surprising restraint. Hezbollah did not open all its fronts. The Houthis played it carefully. The Iraqi groups did not escalate into a full regional conflagration. Why? Because each node in this network has its own local logic, its own constraints, its own calculation of how much risk makes sense given what's happening inside its own country. Hezbollah is right now fighting for political survival inside Lebanon. They're under pressure from the framework agreement, from disarmament demands, from Lebanese political factions, Sunnis, Christians, Druze, who see this moment as an opportunity to permanently diminish Hezbollah's power. Opening a massive military front when you're simultaneously fighting for your domestic political life is not a rational calculation. The Houthis have their own calculus. They need to project enough threat to deter regional adversaries, but not so much aggression that Saudi Arabia or the UAE decides the risk of letting them exist outweighs the cost of eliminating them. The Houthis have their own internal Yemeni dynamics to manage. The Iraqi groups are embedded in the Iraqi state itself. they have government positions, they have budget allocations, they have political parties, they have strong incentives to prefer stability over a war that might cost them everything they've built inside Iraq's formal power structure. What does all of this tell us? The axis of resistance is in a transition, moving from a centralized structure where Tehran coordinates large-scale synchronized operations to a decentralized network where each node operates autonomously based on local conditions, more independent, more adaptive, more domestically embedded than before. And here's the thing, and this is the part that I think Washington is genuinely underestimating. A decentralized, locally embedded network is harder to destroy than a centralized one. To defeat the old axis, you needed to cut the command lines from Tehran. To defeat the new axis, you need to fight each node separately, in each country, under completely different political rules, with completely different domestic implications, at potentially enormous political cost in each case. This is why Hezbollah's refusal to disarm under the trilateral framework is not just about weapons in southern Lebanon. It's a demonstration of what the post-war axis looks like in practice. More dispersed, more locally entrenched, and paradoxically, more resilient than the version that existed before the war began. Because before this conflict, you could target Hezbollah as an extension of Iranian foreign policy. After this conflict, you have to target Hezbollah as a political actor inside a sovereign country called Lebanon. Those are different fights with different legal frameworks, different international legitimacy questions, different costs. And Iran understands this better than any outside observer. They built this system over 30 years. They know that the decentralized version of the axis that emerges from this war is actually more durable than the version that went into it. The octopus lost a tentacle, but it's already working out which tentacles it still has, and figuring out how to make them all a little harder to find. Okay, let me now pull all of this together because I think the full picture becomes very clear when you put the pieces side by side. 40 million barrels of oil in 2 weeks. Iran is financially recovering faster than the consensus predicted using the very resource that the war elevated in price. Hormuz is a weapon by Iran's own declaration. Facts on the ground are being set every day about who has operational authority over the most important shipping lane on earth. Iran won't meet Witkoff face-to-face in Doha, not because they're scared, but because Doha is not where this war is won. Beirut and Hormuz are where it's won. And in both of those places, Iran currently holds structural advantage. The trilateral framework has no credible enforcement mechanism. Hezbollah has already publicly vetoed it. The Lebanese army cannot enforce it without triggering a civil war. American forces in Lebanon can monitor and document. They cannot fight Hezbollah. The axis of resistance is mutating. It's not weaker in the sense of being eliminable. It's decentralizing into a form that is harder to target and more domestically embedded in each country it operates in. China and Russia are providing the economic and diplomatic insulation that prevents American pressure from reaching a breaking point for Tehran. Now, I want to be very honest with you here. I could be wrong about some of this. Okay, I could be completely wrong about the overall conclusion. Take everything I say with a grain of salt. These are my frameworks. These are my theories. I've been wrong before, and I'll be wrong again. But here's what I will say with confidence. The narrative that America is simply winning this comprehensively, that the win-win framing is accurate, that Iran is cornered, that narrative is missing at least 3 structural factors that could fundamentally alter the outcome. And structural factors don't disappear just because your military campaign was impressive. Okay? Based on everything we just walked through, here are 3 specific things I want you to watch very carefully over the next 48 to 72 hours. Number 1, watch whether the United States releases any portion of the $6 billion in frozen Iranian assets. Ghalibaf has been explicit about this. It is a precondition for substantive engagement, not a talking point, a precondition. If America refuses to move on this, if that money stays frozen, the mole is quietly dying and the 60-day clock is running toward a hard deadline with nothing in place. If America agrees to release even part of it, Iran immediately gains leverage going into the next round and will absolutely use it to push for more concessions. There is no scenario where releasing the money makes things simpler for Washington. There isn't. Number 2, Watch what happens when or if the Lebanese armed forces actually try to enter the pilot zones in southern Lebanon. The framework requires La Qamadiya to physically move into designated areas and take operational control from Israeli forces. If La Qamadiya moves in and Hezbollah doesn't obstruct that movement, the deal has a pulse, barely, but a pulse. If Hezbollah politically or physically prevents those movements, which their stated position suggests they will, the entire framework is dead on arrival. And then America faces a choice with genuinely no good options. Let Israel stay in southern Lebanon indefinitely, which contradicts the framework and alienates Beirut. Or pressure Israel to withdraw anyway, which proves the framework was meaningless from the start and cost Washington its credibility with Tel Aviv. Neither of those is a good outcome. Number 3. Watch China's silence on the mandatory Hormuz fee proposal. China imports 40% of its oil through the Strait of Hormuz. China is the country most dependent on that waterway functioning freely. And yet China has said absolutely nothing in opposition to Iran's mandatory fee proposal. Zero statements, zero diplomatic complaints, nothing. In international diplomacy, silence from a major power is never neutral. China's silence is communicating two things simultaneously. To Iran, we are not going to block you on this. To America, do not expect us to join any coalition to stop it. That silence is doing more actual strategic work than anything Washington or Tehran has said out loud this week. Now, here's your homework. I want you to read the 10-point declaration released by 60 members of Iran's Assembly of Experts at the end of June. This is a document where they prohibit Iran's negotiators from making concessions on nuclear rights, where they reaffirm hardline positions that tie the hands of President Pezeshkian's diplomatic team. Read it carefully, and then ask yourself this question: if those are the internal constraints that Iran's negotiators genuinely cannot violate, because their domestic political survival depends on staying within those lines, then what does a final agreement actually look like? What could it possibly contain that both sides could claim as a win? Push back on me if you think I'm missing something. I want you to read the Al Jazeera Center for Studies report on what the MOA actually represents for regional power dynamics. Read the Wall Street Journal piece on Trump weighing renewed strikes on Iran. Read Guy Liebaf's full interview on Press TV, where he calls Hormuz a divine gift. Check the numbers, verify the facts. Challenge the framework I just gave you. I don't want you to accept this analysis uncritically. Because here's the thing I've learned over a long time of studying how these things work. When the mainstream consensus is very comfortable, when everyone seems to agree on a clean, simple narrative about who's winning, that's almost always exactly when you need to look harder at the structural factors the consensus is ignoring. Right now, the consensus says America is in a position of strength and Iran is cornered. I'm saying, look at the 40 million barrels. Look at who's not sitting down in Doha and why. Look at Hezbollah's veto operating in real time. Look at the silence coming from Beijing. Look at the octopus that just took a hit but didn't die and is now figuring out how to grow its tentacles back in a form that's harder to find. And then ask yourself honestly, is that what a cornered country looks like? Okay? And the last thing I want to leave you with today, because I think this is the question that should be genuinely keeping people up at night in Washington right now. When Galibaf stands up and calls Hormuz a divine gift, when Iran keeps refusing to meet face-to-face in Doha while pumping out 50 million barrels of oil, when Iran is pushing for mandatory control over the world's most critical shipping lane, when Hezbollah publicly announces it will never disarm, when China watches all of this and says nothing, the question is not, will Iran sign a final deal? The question that actually matters is this: on day 61, when the window closes, who needs this deal more? Think about that. Sit with it. I'll see you in the next video.